Human trafficking has probably existed as long as there were humans, but remarkably only in the last decade or so has there been any legislation written. And the United Nations put out some proposed legislation. A number of countries and states adopted that legislation. But here in Colorado, some people wanted to know, what does human trafficking really look like? Who, how, why, when, and maybe try and find ways to write some legislation that with teeth that would actually work. So that's kind of the story of, as I understand it, of the Laboratory to Combat Human Trafficking. And our speaker from there is Brittany Austin, with a master's in social work from Chicago, with field work with survivors of torture, and worked with the Chicago Women's AIDS Project. She is surprisingly cheerful and happy, despite what might seem a dark background. Brittany.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, we're going to talk about human trafficking. A little bit heavy, but we'll get through it together. An hour is kind of a short time, so I'm going to dive right in, but feel free to kind of stop me and ask me questions along the way, and I'll try to leave some time for that at the end as well. And I also brought my card and some information about our hotline that you can grab. So if you have follow-up questions later or want to pick my brain about anything, you're welcome to reach out to me over email as well. But as Lori mentioned, I am the program coordinator for the Laboratory to Combat Human Trafficking. I just stepped into this role in June, so new to the organization and to Colorado, but certainly not to human rights abuses and exploitation and root causes of those. So this is our vision, and yes, it's super lofty, but it's why we get up every day. It's why we're doing the work we're doing, so we're not shy about stating that that is what we envision. Our mission statement's a little more tangible. The informed piece, that's in there. It talks about the fact that we use methodologically sound, evidence-based information when we try to broaden awareness and understanding of this issue. So we're not providing anecdotal information. We're always going to be talking about facts with you. Social change speaks to our commitment to getting everyone on the same page when we use the word human trafficking. So we're not talking about the movie Taken, which is a very sensationalized version of this crime. We're not talking about solely sex trafficking and leaving labor trafficking out of the conversation, nor are we talking solely about female survivors and leaving out boys and men. We use the word exploitation purposefully as opposed to trafficking because human trafficking exists sort of like on a continuum of exploitation and abuse. People are kind of moving in and out of potentially exploitative situations all the time. Someone might be experiencing trafficking, yes. Do they always identify that way? No. Someone could be willingly selling sex for survival one day and being forced into it the next day, and then doing it willingly the next day, and then having their wages withheld from it the next day. So it's kind of complicated, and human trafficking often exists in the gray, and so that's why we refer to it as exploitation. This is just a little bit about our organization and our programs. I keep forgetting that it's over there. I don't need to look back there. We have a training and education program. This is part of it. So wonderful people like yourselves want to learn more about this, and they ask us to come speak, and we do. My colleague Kara has trained 3,000 people to date this year, and we're on track to train about 4,000 by the end of the year. We focus a lot on healthcare professionals because we know that the majority of survivors interact with some healthcare professional in some capacity during their experience of exploitation. And so we really want those individuals to know what to look for, how to intervene in a trauma-informed way, and help them develop protocols. We also focus on child welfare and service providers, individuals that might be having clients come in that are experiencing exploitation. And then we also have law enforcement present in small numbers at some of our trainings, and we work to develop partnerships with them so that when we receive tips to our hotline, we have someone we can reach out to who is trained in human trafficking, understands its nuances and complexities, is going to actively avoid re-traumatization when going about their investigation. Our research and action program is in place because we want to understand what the impact is of human trafficking on communities and help people identify gaps and take action to fill those gaps. I'll talk a little bit more about our hotline later, so I'll leave that for now. And then our leadership development program, I think year To date, we've trained over 150 future human rights leaders, people on traditional tracks, non-traditional tracks, people in education programs, people in the workforce wanting to make a career change. Survivor leaders have been a part of that. Nadia is one of the members of our newest cohort. She just arrived here from North Carolina last week from Duke, and is going to be with us through the next 10 weeks. So it's a part of our program that we're really passionate about. So safe space, when you think about human trafficking, what words or images or things come to mind? Go ahead and shout it out.
And kids.
And kids.
Prostitution. Farm workers.
Sorry?
Farm workers.
Farm workers, yeah.
Truckloads of people coming across the border.
Yeah. What do you think, like, people, truck stops, yeah. What about people in your life who may not know what this is at all or be a little bit less informed? Like, what do you think what comes to mind for them when they hear the word human trafficking? Maybe like misconceptions.
Shackles.
Yeah, right. Cool. Okay, so we'll start just with, legal definitions here. This is the simplest definition out there. Human trafficking is a severe form of exploitation for labor, including sex, through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. Force, fraud, and coercion are highlighted there because those things have to be present for it to be human trafficking. If they aren't, you're likely witnessing or hearing about some other type of abuse or exploitation. Is it horrific? Yes. Do we want to support that and end that? Of course, but it's not human trafficking without those things present. The international definition includes sex as a form of labor, which is why it's not sort of parsed out here. When the Trafficking Victims Protection Act was written, the US sort of further defined human trafficking in a little more nuanced way with these 3 categories. This first one's really important to note that force, fraud, and coercion isn't present there. And that's because as a society, we've decided that people under the age of 18, children, don't have the cognitive ability to consent to commercial sex. So if they're engaged in that, they're by definition a victim of human trafficking. And that's complicated. If you think about how that feels for a 16-year-old who doesn't identify as a victim, and they're selling sex willingly, and they don't identify that, they don't want services, they don't want help. Or what that feels like for a 17-year-old who's 5 days shy of their 18th birthday, and someone who just turned 18, and how the response from law enforcement or child welfare is going to differ in those 2 situations, how it affects what resources are available for them, how it affects how they're perceived in the criminal justice system and treated in that way. So not perfect. Important to note that commercial sex acts doesn't just include sex. So it can be prostitution, it doesn't just include prostitution. It can be stripping, it can be pornography, it can be other sex acts. And the commercial component, the thing of value exchange, doesn't have to be money. It can be a place to stay, it could be an iPhone, it could be drugs or alcohol or some form of protection. This part that's in bold on the bottom, we tend to think about human trafficking as this thing that happens elsewhere in other countries, or if it does happen here, it's only happening to immigrants and refugees, people who weren't born here. And that's simply not true. I'll say this anytime I talk about numbers here, like data's sketchy. As Lori mentioned, this is an old crime with a very new response. And so all the data is really nascent. There's a lot of underreporting. It's a very hidden population for many reasons that we'll discuss. But what we do know is that it affects about 50% foreign-born and 50% domestic individuals. It's not just children. Adults are trafficked for both sex and labor as well. And, is being foreign-born a vulnerability here in 2019? Absolutely. Like, we're doing ICE raids in the state. Do we live in a misogynistic society that leaves females a little bit more vulnerable? Absolutely. But we know boys and men are being trafficked for both labor and sex as well. So it's just not limited to these individuals. Another way of understanding the definition of human trafficking is through this action means purpose model. So one thing from each of these categories has to be present for it to be human trafficking. So recruitment, can you think of some ways that people might be recruited today to be exploited in this way? Where?
Runaways.
Runaways, yep, in the streets. Online, happening from schools, at times from shelters. Increasingly, we're seeing it happen outside of drug rehabilitation centers because people who are addicted to substances are more malleable. I'll take your drugs away from you unless you do what I say. I'll give you drugs if you do what I say. You have drugs in your pocket, I'll report you to law enforcement unless you do what I say. Harbor is a little bit of a misconception. You mentioned shackles earlier. So if you Google images of human trafficking, we see these sensationalized things like people behind bars or held by chains. Does it happen? Sometimes, but more often than not, there's something more powerful holding someone in an exploitative situation. It's usually some form of coercion. So typically, traffickers or survivors are free to come and go. You might be standing behind them in the grocery line or riding the bus with them, but they're being, held under some sort of coercive tactic. There's a lot of ways to keep someone somewhere that are more powerful than a locked door. They could threaten to hurt their family members. You could be in the country illegally and be threatened with deportation. Maybe you know something that they did that was embarrassing and you threaten to tell their parents or show everyone at school. So typically it's that's keeping someone tied. Often it's an affiliation too. A lot of people know the person that they're being trafficked by. Sometimes a family member, sometimes a prominent member in their community. More common than we think. Transport is also a little bit of a misconception. So sometimes people move and are moved. Other times they're not. Like I just said, they're trafficked in their own community or in their own family home of origin where they've lived their entire life. So that's not necessarily necessary for it to equate to that. That does occur. Provide, as I mentioned, with drug rehabilitation clinics. With the opioid crisis happening in America, we're seeing this more often. I will provide my children to you for sex if you give me drugs. I will provide myself to you to do whatever you want with me if you let me stay here. Things like that. Obtain, someone said truckloads of people coming over, and like, yes, of course that happens sometimes, but there's this, this misconception being portrayed in the media and under our current administration that people are being snatched from the border and duct tapes over their mouths and they're being put in a van and driven off to Wyoming. And yes, that might happen occasionally, but it's not always that dramatic, if you will. And again, sometimes it's more of a coercive tactic that just kind of like lures someone in. Again, force, fraud, or coercion has to be present, and then there has to be a purpose, some sort of commercial purpose going on. Any questions about that? So we'll talk a little bit more about force, fraud, and coercion. Typically, we see these things happening in conjunction with one another. Usually, fraud and coercion are used to lure someone into an exploitative situation, and then force is brought in later to keep them there. I think force is the easiest one to kind of picture, understand. It could be physical or sexual assault, actually, locking someone in or keeping them there. It can be, threats of that. It could be taking them somewhere else and, not taking their documents so they don't have anywhere to go. Fraud typically starts out as like the promise of something better. So I can get you a job in the US and you'll be able to send money back home to your family that's in need in your community, or you'll be able to save enough money to bring your family over later. You're about to be evicted and you and your kids are going to be on the street. I know a place where you can work so that you can make your rent by tomorrow. Things like that. Being promised a job and then it not turning out that way. Typically it looks okay at first when someone arrives, it looks similar to what was promised. And then slowly over time, liberties start being chipped away. You're asked to do things that weren't part of the original deal. And then 6 months later or many months later, you're in this really full-on exploitative situation there. The coercion can be a really powerful tactic. And when we talk about coercion, we're talking about, persuading someone to do something through intimidation or through, a threat of some sort. So what can that look like? I know where your 12-year-old sister lives. If you don't do what I say, I will hurt her. I know you're in the country illegally. If you don't do what I say, you'll be deported. Your partner's undocumented. If you don't do what I say, I'll call ICE. I have a video of you performing sex acts while high on drugs. I'll show your parents or everyone at the school. You'll be humiliated. I have your passport or your ID in my pocket. Where are you going to go? Can't buy a bus ticket without an ID in the US. So it's a way of asserting ownership over someone. Owing someone money can be a really powerful coercive tactic. We see this play out as debt bondage. This sign was actually right outside the Posner Center where our organization is housed in Rhino. And it says no transportation, no problem, must be 14 years or older, adults welcome, nightly bonuses, weekly paychecks, team environment, holiday start tomorrow. So to us in this room, that might sound a little sketchy and shady and probably not a great idea, but to a 14-year-old kid who's got a single mom trying to pay the bills and they want to help out, that sounds pretty good. To someone who's living on the streets and it's January and it's cold and they're worried about survival or food for their children, they might make that call. And so you call and it turns out it's for a magazine sales crew. You undergo some training, you're driven to Kansas. When you get there, you're told you owe money for the training, the transportation, the food, and the housing that happened during the transportation. And so you have a debt to pay off. You'll start working to pay off that debt, no problem. And then you're given unreasonable sales quotas that you can't meet. And so you just keep accruing debt and you're in the situation that you cannot get out of. Easier to find yourself there than we might think. These are, do you all hear these terms sort of conflated with trafficking ever? So just to clear it up, we talk about this, like smuggling is a crime against the border, human trafficking is a crime against a human, so it's human rights abuse. They're two separate things, they can be intertwined. We see sometimes I pay someone to bring me across the border into the US illegally. When we arrive, they say, oh, I had to hide you for 2 extra weeks, you owe me $1,500. I don't have it. Okay, come with me, I'll show you where you can work it off. And then similarly to what I just described, they end up brought to Denver, work at a construction site or at a restaurant, some sort of like low wage, semi-informal market. And they start accruing debt related to the transport here, to their rent, and they can't pay it off, and they enter the country illegally. You know, they don't know their rights. Maybe they don't speak the language. What are they going to do? So two separate things, but are intertwined. And then with prostitution, prostitution itself does not equal trafficking. So regardless of how we feel about sex work or its legality, in most parts of the US, it's still legal. Prostitution, as it stands alone, is not trafficking unless there's force, fraud, or coercion present, or unless you're under the age of 18. So again, I mentioned earlier that when we think about human trafficking, I think it's a form of self-protection often. We think about something that's happening way far away from us, other countries, not in our country, certainly not in our own community, certainly not to anyone I know or love, other people who are making bad choices, homeless people, stupid people, whatever you want to say, you hear these things. And really human trafficking occurs when someone steps in and fills a need that's not being met for someone by the rest of society. So if we think about relationships first, for someone who is isolated in their family or community, we all crave human connection, something like we're desirous of and need. We meet someone that says, I love you, you're beautiful. That sounds pretty good if we've never heard that before in our lives. And there are people who've never heard that before in their lives. Someone says, I'll marry you, or I'll be like your mother, your father, we'll be like your family. We as humans just lean into that and listen. And with that, the potential for recruitment and grooming and exploitation arises. I'll talk a little bit more in detail about homelessness and some numbers as it relates to Colorado in a moment. But I just moved here in June from Los Angeles, and I hear it gets really cold here in January. People keep talking about the bomb cyclone night that occurred. And we're always asking people to think about, like, what did it feel like to be homeless that day? And wonder, where am I going to sleep tonight? How am I going to survive? Camping is also illegal in Denver. So in addition to your life being threatened, you run the risk of being arrested if you're sleeping on the street. So my choices are potentially freeze to death, get arrested, or get in the car with this person and do something I don't really want to do in order to survive the night. And people make hard choices like that every single day. There's a lot of people in our country who have trouble accessing formal job markets for various reasons. People with a felony, someone with a misdemeanor of prostitution that carries a stigma, someone with little or no job history, someone who's been discriminated against and fired, again, a young child who wants to work and support their family because they need it. If you need income, you're going to call that number on that flyer, even if it seems a little bit sketchy. If you're about to be evicted and you and your kids are going to be living in your car, you're going to take a job that doesn't really sound all that right and potentially end up in a really dangerous and exploitative situation as a result of that. People are just trying to survive. And lastly, like, people with marginalized identities are extremely vulnerable. So if we think about a refugee who's in this country and has not encountered anybody who speaks their native language, and they're approached by someone who does and says, meet me for coffee, I speak your language, I'll help you settle in here. That sounds really good. We think about a transgender youth who's been shunned by their family and their community, and they meet someone who says, you're perfect just as you are, I'll help you transition and pay for the medicine you need. That's compelling. And so again, like, we lean into that, and potentially if exploitative situations arise. I just want to repeat, like, these people that end up being exploited aren't bad people, and stupid people. They're not making bad choices. They someone is stepping in and filling a need that wasn't met for them, and traffickers are winning in that way, and like the rest of society needs to do better at filling those gaps. Yes, as I mentioned, homelessness is a problem anywhere you look, everywhere you look in their country, but these numbers are stark. So 150 people a month are paroled directly into homelessness, often aren't resourced. 1 in 4 households are spending 70% of their income on housing and utilities. That just means you're vulnerable to eviction and homelessness. There are 50 evictions per day in Colorado. Those are only formal evictions. It doesn't count somebody who's not going through the formal process and just kicking people out, discriminating. You also have to consider that an average household, and maybe that's 4 people, so that's 200 people a day that are being evicted into homelessness. Average home price has risen by 77%, but the income has only risen by 4.5%. That's stark. We're currently seeing the largest displacement of Latinx communities in the entire country. And this last slide, this life expectancy, the fact that it lowers by 30 to 40 years, it really is like a life and death situation. So again, if you're choosing between, a job you don't really want to do, or a situation that doesn't seem safe, and being on the street and potentially leading to that, you make hard choices. To talk about Colorado, sort of specifically in what industries and what regions we have here that sort of contribute to trafficking, or I would say, like, allow it to exist. We have a lot of big agriculture industry, construction, and tourism. These are all industries that rely on temporary seasonal work, temporary visas, immigrant labor, low-wage work, sometimes informal markets, not always. Is everybody working in those industries being trafficked? Of course not. But there are a lot of vulnerabilities within those industries, and it is happening there. We have this, I didn't know this when I came, but does anyone know we have like a huge sheep herding industry in the northwest part of the state? Yeah, okay. So lots of sheep herding going on there. Lamb that anyone's eating in Denver is usually coming from there. Labor used to be imported from Basque Country. After the revolution, that stopped, so they started looking for a new place to find cheap labor. They turned towards Peru, where they'd been sheep herding for many years, and found indigenous individuals that were good at the work and marginalized by their own communities, and brought them over on H-2A and H-2B visas. It's legal in our country to pay people on those visas $1,350 a month for way more than full-time labor. Until recently, it was $750 a month, and some really intense lobbyists and activists got that raised. But these are individuals who speak an indigenous language called Quechua. Maybe they speak Spanish, some Spanish as their second language. They're working in a very remote part of the state. They're reliant on their employer for food and water and housing, often aren't aware of their rights. The people that are, the visas tie you to one specific employer. So if you have an issue with your employer, it's not like you can go complain and they set you up with another job. You have to go home. So it's an extreme power dynamic there, kind of a perfect storm of that. And the individuals that own this land are mostly white, male, rich homesteaders who've owned the land for generations and are just passing it down. And so they own half of Main Street. They know law enforcement, they know schools. Not everyone is trafficking these workers, but we have a lot of cases. We partner with Colorado Legal Services, and a lot of cases of labor trafficking happen out of there. We hear reports of people being dropped off a couple blocks from the hospital and being told if you tell them that this injury happened on the job, you'll be deported. So yeah, some extreme power dynamics there that leave room for exploitation to occur. My colleague Kara lives up in Frisco, and she talks often about the fact that there's 2,000 people that live there, but there's beds for 12,000. And so that's a lot of people coming in and out. And we don't often stop to think about who's making those beds, who's cleaning those rooms, who's doing that labor, and who's paying attention to whether their rights are being abused. Again, are they all being trafficked? No, but there's vulnerabilities there. Tourism plays a part. There was a case up near Frisco where 2 guys rented out an Airbnb and were pimping out underage girls for sex to tourists. Presumably those tourists didn't know those girls were being trafficked. They were just looking to buy sex. Presumably they didn't know that they were under the age of 18 either. But that case did occur there. Another was a young undocumented woman was being kept as a servant in the home of a couple. She was fed and housed, but she wasn't allowed to leave and was not paid for her work. She was there for 2 years. She was found crying in a stairwell, and the story unraveled from there. And that couple doesn't think they did anything wrong, so they justify it in their heads by saying she was happy here, it's better than where they came from. How they kind of rationalize it. And we hear that those types of things a lot. We have a number of highways in Colorado, mostly coming up from the southern border. These are known routes for trafficking of drugs and humans. Denver International Airport is the only international airport within a 500-mile radius. And then immigration fluxes. So our immigrant labor force makes up 22% of the workforce here in Colorado. And that plays a part with, the numbers I was talking about in relation to homelessness. 1 million people have moved to Colorado in the last 10 years. 450,000 of them to Denver alone. I'm always apologizing because I'm one of those people. And I brought 2 people with me. So, but that contributes to rising house costs, homelessness, all these things that leave people vulnerable. I'm going to talk about, do this first.
You said something about BIA, only international airport with 500 miles of
Just a 500-mile radius, I think. I'm not even sure where the next one is, but
radius of what?
Here.
here, like,
From the airport.
okay.
What's the BIA?
Yeah, like from where I'm standing, basically, there's no other airport within 500 miles from here. And so any international travel is happening through that airport. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I thought they were closest to the border.
Oh, no. It just means that any of that travel coming in and out of there is happening through through our city. This was data gathered from Colorado Project 1.0, which was LCHT's research project. We've since done a 2.0 that you should check out. It's on our website. But these were just settings where exploitation was identified during that research. I always mention you'd be surprised to know how often involuntary servitude and arranged or forced marriages is occurring, especially with individuals who are seeking status here. Forced drug muling is something that we're seeing happen. So young kids in vulnerable communities south of the border are being forced to bring drugs across the border by gang members. When they arrive on the other side, the drugs are taken and the boys are just left there. So you talk about vulnerability, you've entered the country illegally, you brought drugs with you. You maybe don't speak the language, probably not. You don't have any identification or any money. So they're prime candidates. Someone sees them, oh, you need help? I've got a job for you. Okay, cool, I'll go with you. And then they bring them here to Denver and they're forced to sell drugs in the street. You don't want to do that? Well, I know you brought drugs across the country. I'll report you to law enforcement. You're going to leave where you don't have your passport in my pocket, or you don't even have identification with you, period. What are you going to do? I mentioned this before, but increasingly, we're seeing that interfamilial pimping is occurring. 50% of individuals are related to their trafficker. I know that's really hard to sit with. But these aren't strangers being snatched off the street. Yes, they're being recruited online, but it's also happening within families, within communities. And that's important to recognize, especially when we think about root causes and what's going on in that community, what's going on in that household that leads someone to that end. So what is wrong with this slide or the images you see here? What does it include? What does it exclude? What's missing?
No men.
Girls. What else?
Why not?
All young. Yep. They also look really helpless, like a misogynistic undertone here. Contributes to this like savior complex we have around women and young girls. And it excludes all these individuals. So men, boys, women of color. And that's a problem because it, these perpetuate stereotypes we have about trafficking, who it affects and who's vulnerable to it. That affects the resources that get created for these individuals. We don't have enough resources in general for survivors of human trafficking, especially as it relates to housing. It's a huge problem, a huge gap. But there is a significant dearth of resources for boys and men, even though we know that they're being trafficked for both labor and sex. And this, it messes with our data. It informs the way we all approach the work. So it's a big problem because it creates this feedback loop. And I think that there's, I could talk all night about like why we always turn towards sex trafficking and sex trafficking of females only when we talk about it. We need to keep talking about that, of course. But I think it's easier for people to like resolve themselves of, any involvement or contribution when it comes to sex trafficking. Okay, I'm not involved in the commercial sex industry, so I'm not a part of this. It's not my responsibility. And it's harder to do with labor trafficking. Like, where did our food come from? Where did this isn't my iPhone, so I'm not going to touch it, but like our phones. Where are those? Who's creating those? Who's making those? It gets a little dicey there, and so it's hard to turn towards these things, but we need to. Speaking of that, when we talk about human trafficking and exploitation happening in other countries, we're like really quick to acknowledge the socioeconomic factors that contribute to it. So things like poverty, migration, war, the like existence of a legal sex industry in another country. And when we talk about it here, we ignore all that and we focus on individual pathologies, and which fails to frame the issue appropriately, and we end up victim blaming. So you hear people saying things like, "Why didn't he just leave?" Or "Who would want to give all their money over to a pimp?" Or "Why did they go back?" Instead of asking questions like, well, if they did leave, did he have a safe place to go? Or why was that person there in the first place? How do things like race and class and gender identity affect this crime? How bad is the housing crisis? How many people are experiencing homelessness? These are really like big issues that are hard to turn towards. They're overwhelming. But if you want to understand this crime, if you want to talk about it, if you want to combat it, you have to recognize that these parallel movements are intertwined with it. Human trafficking doesn't happen in a silo. These experiences are embedded and intertwined with survivors' experiences, and they absolutely contribute to someone's vulnerability to experience this crime. Yes.
I noticed that climate change isn't on there, and I'm thinking that
should be.
Yeah. And, the other thing is, I noticed that the elderly are not there. Does that mean they don't ever get
on this slide?
Traffic?
It does not mean that. So it spans the lifespan. The oldest trafficking survivor identified in Colorado was 74 and was being kept as a servant in a home. And the youngest, these individuals were intercepted, so this did not occur, but the youngest were 2 siblings under the age of 3. So it really does expand. I should have mentioned this earlier, so I'm sorry that I didn't, but this isn't an easy thing to talk about, and none of us walk through life untouched by trauma. So we come to this conversation with our own lived experiences or various, forms of trauma, or people we know that have been affected by things close to this. And so if you need to tune me out at any time or take some deep breaths or leave the room, you're more than welcome to, because this is, I recognize this is heavy. So. Everybody okay? Okay. Well, then we'll talk about a few specific cases. So these aren't nice stories. When Sean Crumpler was first arrested in 2014, he was a 50-year-old white man living in this nice looking home in Aurora that he was renting. And he was accused of recruiting young, vulnerable youth from California, LGBT boys, to come live with him as sex slaves. And in exchange for sex with him and other people who would visit the home, they were given food, you know, a roof over their heads, drugs, alcohol. When the younger boys would get older, he would have them go out and recruit new younger boys to come in as well. He is in jail for the rest of his life, sentenced to 50 years in prison and convicted on multiple counts, one of which was knowingly passing on HIV to his victims. And it took many, many years for anybody to notice. You know, this is a nice neighborhood in Aurora. When they did kick the door down, there were 12 naked boys between the ages of 16 and 21. They're all under the influence of drugs. I know too that, like, I think it's a common misconception that, like, anybody who ends up in a trafficking situation and is using drugs was a drug user prior. And that's not true. Sometimes it is, that's okay. But other times they're given drugs in the beginning. It makes it easier to maybe do the work that they don't want to do. And then eventually they become addicted because they're just trying to numb the pain of this experience that they're having. So just something to keep in mind. We talked earlier about fraud and how that plays out. So these are two examples that speak to that. So the Skizzy Kalu case, he owned an apartment building and he created a recruitment company, got it accredited, but it doesn't actually exist. And he recruited healthcare workers from the Philippines to come over and work in promising them jobs in the healthcare sector. When they got here, they were working in remote elder care facilities, working really, really long hours, cleaning, doing all these sorts of things that weren't part of their original job. They were told, and he brought them over legally on J-1 visas. And when they got here, he told them that they owed him money for the travel related to their recruitment, which is illegal. That's always on the recruiter to pay when it's happening legally. And then he forced them to live in the apartment building that he owned. So they started also accruing debt related to rent. They were given paychecks for less than $1 for a full week's worth of work, with tons of itemized deductions related to all of these things. Again, they didn't know their rights. They thought it was a temporary situation, that they'd eventually pay it off and start earning income. This photo is of a condemned house that laborers were forced to live in. It was a big organic farm that used to advertise on NPR. My colleague used to buy vegetable boxes from them. They hired a recruiter to go back to Mexico and recruit labor from his community, which is legal to do and super common for large farms to do. So they came over. When they got here, they were forced to live in this condemned house. There were dead animals on site. The recruiter walked the fields every day with a gun and then lived in a trailer next to this house. So they were constantly surveilled. There was a 9-foot chain link fence around the house. Excruciating long hours without any sun protection, little food and water, and not healthy water. They were allowed to go to church on Sundays, and a nun identified them as in need of support because of they had lost a lot of weight. They were working out in the fields all the time, had extreme sun exposure and burns and things like that. The recruiter was arrested. He was let out on bail, and he did go back to their communities in Mexico and hurt the families like he told them he would. When they arrived, he said, if you tell anybody what's going on, I'll hurt your families. They did receive the numbers escaping me now, $7.8 million, I think, settlement, and were able to bring their families over to the US to be reunited. So there's some resolution there. Okay. You mentioned your email just wanting me to talk about a little bit, like what might indicate that someone is experiencing exploitation if you come across them in a setting. And so we go over these with healthcare professionals. But yeah, unexplained injuries, so like multiple scars, broken teeth, or burns, some sort of like prolonged infection or an injury that clearly occurred like a month ago, and it's like, why haven't you been in to get this treated? That's a really common sign. Things start to, my colleague knows someone who's, what's this bone escaping me? Radius, yes, was broken and literally just started to heal in this very awkward shape because it had been so long since the time of injury that they came in. Yeah, yeast infections are, frequent or repeated STIs, multiple frequent pregnancy or abortions, and then just general signs of malnourishment or poor health. We're seeing a lot of dental issues, which makes sense. If they're not letting you go in for regular medical care, you're certainly not being able to see a dentist. Again, sun exposure, like I talked about. Injuries related to repeated motion, so somebody that might be forced to work 18 hours on some sort of machine. Respiratory problems, like we think that we don't dump chemicals onto fields in the US while people are working on them, and we do, it happens. Chronic back pain, sometimes that's related to physical labor, sometimes that's a somatic complaint due to PTSD. Tattoos or other types of branding. If, like, not everyone you see that has a tattoo is being trafficked. Like, don't go to Rhino and think all of those individuals working in coffee shops are experiencing exploitation, but it is a thing that occurs, and we do have relationships with tattoo artists in the area who will do removal for free for individuals who've been branded in that way. Drugs and alcohol, these things are intertwined. Evidence of sexual trauma. Behavioral indicators, so yeah, if like someone shows up at your door selling you magazines and you ask them where they're living and they don't really know, maybe they don't know exactly where they are, they say they're just visiting, that's concerning. Someone who with inconsistencies in their story, or someone who exhibits a lost sense of space and time. We have this like tendency to like disbelieve people, one, when they're telling us something really horrific that we don't want to believe happened, and two, if it seems like they're lying, like we turn away from that. But that's how trauma affects the brain. We don't remember things linearly, and so it's going to feel like someone's bouncing all over the place, when in actuality that's just like how they're remembering events. Question.
So, like, if somebody comes to your house, please, yeah. I mean, you think that you see somebody in a situation like this, what do you do?
Yeah.
What do you do?
Yeah, we'll talk about the hotline a little bit, but we can, I brought some cards for you, and you can have some of those on hand, and if it seems safe and there's no one lurking over their shoulder, you could flip them one. Maybe it feels awkward because maybe that person isn't being trafficked, but then they have the information just in case.
Well, I have some, like I said, rather young children are being told they're from Nebraska,
right?
And they're first day of work.
Yep.
And I'm sitting with
right?
And I don't know what to do. So I figured that, I mean, they seem really young, and I have no idea.
So you can call the hotline when that happens, and we'll report it to law enforcement. Yeah, now you know, which is why I'm glad we're here. But we'll send someone to that community to look into it. And we receive those tips a lot. Happens a lot in the Springs. And you can ask them questions. You know, like, where's your employer? You know, someone will say, oh, he's coming back to get me at 10 p.m. and it's 8 a.m. And you're like, that's a really long work day. You know, like, when's the last time you got paid? Things like that. You don't need to over involve and insert yourself, but you can ask a few questions if it seems okay. Exactly, that's exactly what happens. Yeah, you can pass them some information, and then you can call that in. We receive those often. Let's see. Yeah, if you're in a healthcare setting and there's someone in the room who's speaking on behalf of that individual, even if they don't speak the language and they're acting as their interpreter, we've seen that happen where young female Asian person who appears really nice is translating for someone who's getting services, and that person is part of an operation. So whenever possible, you want to try to get an interpreter in the room that works for you or your organization or your setting. In that instance, someone who doesn't have control over their own documents. So you ask for their ID, and the person that they're with hands it to you instead. Concerning. Not making eye contact. Again, that can be cultural, so just keep that in mind. In some cultures, it's really forward to make eye contact all the time. And then just keep in mind to think about these as like red flags. Like, not one of these things does not equate to trafficking, but if you start to notice both of these, creating like a constellation of sorts, then there's a reason to lean in and ask more questions. It's 2019, there's lots of non-traditional families, and there's lots of relationships that don't look like the 1950s anymore. So like, if every young girl with an older man like being trafficked, no. We get calls like, oh, it's all this guy and he's with a really young girl and it doesn't much to go on, what else? Then we ask what else. So just careful there. I think sometimes whenever there's a lot of headlines in the news around trafficking, like the Jeffrey Epstein case, where we do training, we tend to kind of start to see it everywhere. So just watch that. Yeah, I don't know about past medical care, all these behavioral things. It also happens, like someone's either in extreme crisis or like there's a lot going on and they're just totally numb to it. That's how they've learned to cope with their experience. They might resist your help. Maybe they're fearful because they had a really shitty experience. I said I wasn't in a curse, sorry. for the recording, with some sort of healthcare professional in the past, or they're irritable, like I would be too if I was experiencing that. Let's see. So just some numbers that give you an idea of like what this looks like globally. And again, it helps dispel that myth that people are only being trafficked for sex. You see how many people are being forced into labor of all types, including forced marriages. And then you see that, yes, women and girls are overrepresented here, but it's not exclusive of boys and men. And it does happen to children, and adults. We talked about a number of debt bondage examples here, and so you can see how representative that is in the numbers. How am I doing on that? There was a debt bondage situation that happened in Denver at a really nice, popular sushi restaurant. Two chefs were brought over from Japan, promised a job. When they got here, they were forced to work in the restaurant all day and then clean the restaurant all night. Again, they were told that they had debt related to travel. They were forced to live at the restaurant, which is definitely an indicator if someone's being forced to live where they work. And so they were also accruing rent debt. And again, they didn't know their rights. They thought it was a temporary situation that they'd eventually be paid off. Somebody eventually noticed and reported it, and they did receive a settlement. But we see these cases all the time.
Could
Yeah.
you put that
Yep.
slide back up again? That last line. 1 in 4 children were victims of modern slavery. Is that
Means 25% of of children under the age of 18 worldwide have experienced trafficking.
25%? Wow. Children worldwide, all children worldwide have experienced. Holy cow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You mentioned they received the settlement.
Yes.
How about criminal prosecution?
What do you mean? Like what happened to the perpetrator?
Yes.
I don't know. I don't remember the exact details of that case. I definitely assume the restaurant closed, was no longer successful, and that they received some sort of prosecution. But a couple of things I can talk about in relation to that and why it's complicated. And I'm sorry I don't have an answer about that specific case. But for some people, for some survivors, justice does not equal, the criminal justice system. For some people, they want to be free of the situation and access support and services and move on with their lives. And we believe in self-determination, so we respect that. So if a survivor calls the hotline, they don't want to report to law enforcement, we don't. We are seeing more cases popping up and more prosecutions happening, but those numbers, they don't accurately represent the amount of, I would say, cases that are coming to light, because it's really hard to prove forced fraud or coercion. So often something may look like human trafficking, but it gets prosecuted as something else. They plea out with child kidnapping or domestic violence or some other sort of crime because it's just simply easier to prosecute it.
Well, I have another follow-up question.
Mm-hmm.
If they supposedly received a settlement, did they actually receive the money, or this restaurant just went out of business?
No, they received the money. Definitely. Yeah.
So what do you do for these people if they don't want to report it to the police?
We connect them to whatever they want. They want housing, great. They want, well, not great because we have severe housing shortage here. They want to get their GED, we connect them to an organization that can help them with that. They want higher education, we connect them to a program at MSU that supports survivors seeking their degrees. They want to get a tattoo removed, we support them with that. They need food, they want job assistance, case management services. It just depends on they want to move from Denver to another state because they want to be away from their trafficker. We help coordinate that. Our hotline operates as a typical referral hotline, and so we're not providing those services within our organization. We're connecting them to other organizations that do that work.
So they could, in effect, be lost in the system again and fall back into trafficking.
It's very common for people to go back and forth, and eventually, very similar to domestic violence. There's trauma bonds present. It's really complicated and common. They're also, like I said, I had someone call the hotline earlier today who needed housing tonight. And if not, they were going to go back and stay with their trafficker again. It's not by choice. It's because the shelter that we recommended, they had a bad experience at once, or this one is full, or I got recruited out of that shelter, I got raped at that shelter. And there's very limited funding and availability for like emergency hotel vouchers. And so in situations like that, yes, that happens. We try to really focus on, oftentimes when someone's calling a hotline, like in any field, really, not just in trafficking, hotlines and crisis lines are often someone's first time that they're reaching out, or they're reaching out because they had a really bad experience in some other sort of predatory system of care, or a traditional system of care. And so we try to make those interactions really positive ones. We don't overwhelm someone's capacity for change. If they're like, I'm with my trafficker, I'm gonna stay with my trafficker, I just wanna know what's out there. Cool, I'll tell you what's out there. And then maybe another day when they're in a different stage of change, they'll call us back.
So is this like a national organization, or is there a national central organization that takes care of this? Who pays for all this?
When you say this, like the work that LCHT does,
Human trafficking.
Human Trafficking, I mean, there's tons of effort. So like our organization is like primarily like research and training education focused. We don't provide direct services. We do operate this hotline. And then we work in partnership with various organizations, like 300 across the state of Colorado, that are working to address human trafficking or some form of exploitation or root cause related to it. There's a national hotline, a national organization called the Polaris Project, which is another research group that does a lot of work out of Washington, D.C. There's coordination interstate and between states, probably could be improved.
So this national organization, Polaris, is it funded by something? Or is it businesses? Or?
I think it's like, I think it's a mix of government and private funding.
So most of the organizations who work in trafficking or anti-trafficking movements are funded both by government and individuals.
Yeah, we have both our organization.
Yep. So does mine. So grants and individual funding, donations.
This is Sam. She's also part of our leadership development.
So there's no real central organization that coordinates everything.
Not one.
Not the UN, something like that.
I mean, the UN doesn't dictate like our strategic plan or our mission statement or something like that. Do we work collaboratively? Sure. Like we're listening to one another, we're reading each other's reports and things like that. But there's not like one umbrella that we're all operating underneath.
So like no anti-ICE.
I'm anti-ICE.
So if a person calls your hotline
Yeah.
and says the three words, I've been forced to whatever, and they used fraud and I was coerced, do you automatically call the police, or are you waiting for them to say the magic word of, I want you to?
Yeah, really great question. I want to clear one thing up. With force, fraud, and coercion, it only has to be one of those things. So not all three things have to be present for it to be trafficking and to be prosecuted as that. If I would say 9 out of 10 survivors that call us want to report to law enforcement, opposite. 9 out of 10 do not want to report to law enforcement. They just want resources. That doesn't mean that they might not, that they're not going to maybe pursue justice through the criminal justice system later, but typically they need stabilization first.
But so what does your organization do? Will you call the police?
I will not call the police if someone does not want me to call the police.
So they would have to say to you, please don't call the police. Or if they call and don't know what to do.
Yeah.
Would your organization ever notify the police?
Only if they ask me to. When we get calls, so about a third of our calls come from survivors, a third are from community members, like reporting a tip, like you said. I've noticed something suspicious, I want to say it. In those instances, we do call the police. And then the others are from service providers. And so, that's a delicate balance too. Sometimes the service provider might call in concerned, and it might not be safe to involve the police. That might get that person in more trouble in that instance. So they're calling us for guidance and to know about resources and what to do next. And other times, it is appropriate to involve the police. We have relationships with law enforcement officers who have been trained, they get it, they care, they'll do wellness checks in plain clothes. They're not going to go in guns blazing and create chaos in a situation. And they're actively avoiding re-traumatization. They're also discreet sometimes. So maybe they look into something and they say, you know, it looks like something's going on here, maybe some prostitution or something. I don't want to get anybody in trouble. I'm going to back off. Not human trafficking.
So there's always the problem of whether they're going to arrest the prostitute or the cause of the trafficking.
Exactly, because it's really, I mean, you encounter someone who's selling sex on the street and their trafficker is a block away watching them. That trafficker is not going to come up and say, "Oh, I'm forcing her to do this." So how do you prove it?
You don't have investigators on your level.
No, we just work in partnership with them. We have people that we can call if we need to.
Do you see any correlation between cities that claim to be sanctuary cities and lives of people?
It's a really good question. We know that, you know, being foreign-born is a vulnerability. I think it's right now the numbers are hard. So you'll see headlines that like Denver is a hub for human trafficking. And you have to think about the fact that some of that is related to the fact that like there's some pretty coordinated and impressive efforts here in the state of Colorado, which means there's more awareness of it, and more survivors are coming forward, and there's more prosecutions occurring. So that makes those numbers go up. And so some of that, you know, could be affecting that as well. I don't know that that's actually the case, but if there was, do you have any?
We haven't noticed, like, from we haven't noticed that safety and cities have an increase in trafficking. I've done work in other countries, and trafficking is an exploitation as a whole is, I mean, larger in those countries than it is here. It's a global problem. You're going to see more trafficking in third world countries than you are going to be in any.
What about in your research, Nadia? Nadia's doing some research on refugees and asylees. Have you come across any numbers related to that?
I think refugees are definitely more vulnerable. There's vulnerabilities there, but I wouldn't say it's higher or lower.
Higher in cities in general, too. Like we receive more calls in the Denver metro area than in rural areas, but it's happening everywhere.
Are you able to check public policy at all or educate policymakers?
I'd like to think that we don't, when we, I think as an organization made a strategic decision, we're not lobbyists, like we're not engaging there, but we are, like we had the trafficking in persons report came out recently, and they name individuals called tip heroes every year, and these are individuals who are working in various countries addressing human trafficking, and they're just recognized for their work. And they came and visited our organization, and we talked about like what's working well here, what's not, what's working well in their countries, what's not, what we can learn from one another. Additionally, there's a survivor, the word is escaping me, 9 p.m., that serves the Survivor Council, that like, it's a government body. Basically a bunch of survivor leaders that like help inform the government about how to go about combating this crime. And they visited us last month as well and asked us to contribute to like what if they said, you know, what do you think are the missing pieces? And we gave them 4 things that we think are really important that we want to be included in their report that they hand over to the President of the United States. In that way, yes, but we're not going about like, we're not calling senators or actively lobbying in that way.
Are they calling you?
It's a good question. I mean, they're not calling the hotline. No.
Are they calling asking for advice?
No.
I don't think, tell me if I'm wrong, because Denver doesn't have as many journalists as it used to with the right we don't have people watchdog journalists asking questions constantly. Don't you find that to be true? Or is there some organization I don't know about that is coming to you and asking questions?
No, like there was an article I can send to Lori to share with you all recently in 5280 that came out about labor trafficking in Colorado and they did ask us questions, but no, it's not like we're getting hit up for like media stories all the time. It's not, that common that people are writing about this. And I don't know if it's because of a result of what you're talking about. Yeah.
that Denver is a place that doesn't have that kind of service.
It's difficult. It's a challenge. Mhm. Yeah, I'm gonna just see, so this just like represents the sort of task force and coalitions that exist in Colorado. I just want you to see there's actually 3 more that have popped up since, so there's 20 total, more in the Denver metro area. They're clustered around the highways as well, but there's also areas in remote. LCHT sits on 4 of these, and we helped consult when they were forming or developing, and some of them are led by law enforcement, some are service providers, some are like super grassroots community-led efforts, people that just got together and said, what are we gonna do about this? They're super cool. They have meetings often. I can let you know when they are and where they are if you're interested in attending and learning more. And then if you don't mind, I have hotline cards here, but maybe put this number in your phone. And then you have it in case you see something, and you can call us or text us. If you know somebody that might want to be a volunteer for the advocate, like our hotline staffed entirely by volunteers. They're amazing. They get great training. You can have them reach out to me about that opportunity. This is how we connect people to those resources. And
You do any educational outreach to either organization? If they don't have the resources to come to you, do you have like a press release network?
I don't know, we have a network. We have, Craig's our communications guy and does a pretty stellar job. If we get requests to speak, as much as possible, we try to go. Whether it's a group of 5 people around the table, students in a program who want to learn more, or like a larger 100-person healthcare training. Our areas of focus are healthcare, child welfare, and service providers.
If you're not proactively distributing.
Not like a coordinated effort to media, yeah. I feel like I think I've kept us over, but I'm only 1 minute over. If something comes up later that's burning, again, my cards are over here, so feel free to reach out. Yeah, more. Thank you for your amazing questions and attention. I really appreciate you holding space for this conversation, this issue. Yeah.